Greetings, podcast listeners. Welcome to History from one student to another, and another episode from my series on Stalin's Russia. Up until 1928, Stalin and Bukharin presented themselves as the upholders of Lenin's legacy through his 1921 new economic policy, but this had changed by 1928, when Stalin completely cut down the new economic policy and took steps which were even more radical than what the left opposition had been advocating for. In this episode, I'll be speaking about the economic policies which were in place in Stalin's Russia. As the episode begins, please subscribe or click follow to be notified when new episodes are released. Since its implementation, many communists feared the long-term consequences of tolerating and encouraging the capitalist elements culminating in the NEP. Problems with the new economic policy existed as early as 1924, but became increasingly prevalent in the years 1926 and 1927. In August 1924, Soviet economist Evgeny Preobrazhensky published The Fundamental Law of Socialist Accumulation, which theorized that the state should purchase food from peasants at a low price and sell it to consumers at a higher price to provide funds for industrialization. This idea was supported by Trotsky, but opposed by Stalin, who saw it as a threat to Lenin's new economic policy. This conflict remained a significant factor in the power struggle between the right, center, and left. The area of the economy which I'll be speaking about first is industry. In the mid-1920s, Trotsky's left opposition argued with Bukharin and Stalin's Center Party over the industry, with the left campaigning for increased industrialization and the center supporting maintaining Lenin's legacy. However, by April 1925, Bukharin's policies were becoming more rightist and he was drifting away from Stalin. In the 14th Party Congress in December 1925, Stalin had come around to accepting the need for economic modernization, but the criticisms of the NEP made by Zinoviev and Kamenev were still rejected. Having planned its first economic plan in August 1925, Gosplan, the Soviet Union's state planning commission responsible for economic development, the organization of social services, etc., released a second plan in 1926, focusing on the development of the Soviet economy. At this time, conservative non-party specialists were concerned about short-term economic development and possibilities, whilst party specialists believed in rapid industrialization, which was being blocked by the new economic policy. Although the existing industry had practically been restored to pre-war levels of production, in 1927, Stalin used the rising fear of war to spark policies for rapid industrialization for the Soviets to meet any possible invasion. Stalin began to adopt some of the economic policies that were proposed by the left opposition. These involved cutting administrative costs to increase funding for industrial development and introducing a Hero of Labor medal to promote productivity and labor discipline. Despite this, there were no major targets put in place for industry, aside from the development of some hydroelectric projects and railway and canal routes. It was not really until the grain crisis of 1927 and 1928 that Stalin came around to abandoning Lenin's NEP and favoring rapid industrialization. This caused a major conflict between Stalin and Bukharin, with Stalin's supporters accusing opponents of having a lack of faith in the Soviet people and betraying the socialism of the Bolsheviks. After practically defeating the right faction, Stalin advocated for higher production targets from Bezenka, the superior state institution for management of the economy, and Gosplan. Together, they developed two 5-year economic plans, the basic variant and the optimum variant, the latter being accepted by Politburo. The first 5-year plan launched on the 1st of October 1928 with a focus on heavy industry. The target for overall production was an increase of 300%. To provide for this, electricity production was to increase sixfold. With many industries expected to increase, workers were inspired by the vision of a strong, united Soviet economy in which they worked hard to meet the yearly targets. Stalin's propaganda soon emerged, parading the idea that targets were being exceeded, as proclaimed by the poster saying 2 + 2 = 5, which had the idea that the plan would be fulfilled in 4 years rather than 5. There were significant achievements towards transforming the Soviet economy, including the establishment of hundreds of new factories and mines in previously unexplored regions. This was important as, according to Stalin in 1931, the Soviet Union's economy was up to 100 years behind. In December 1932, Stalin announced the first 5-year plan had been achieved. In reality, no major targets had been achieved, And despite the incredible growth that was seen, problems were introduced by the successes of the first 5-year plan. The costs for implementing the plan were larger than initially planned for by Gosplan, whilst the increases in coal, iron and industrial goods overwhelmed the underdeveloped railway system. Meanwhile, urban populations were increasing rapidly, and the issue of housing shortages soon emerged, threatening the progress of industrialization. Moreover, forced agricultural collectivization resulted in food shortages, rationing, and famine. This contributed to the issue of workers changing jobs frequently, which in turn led to managers having to increase wages and benefits to retain the skilled workers required to achieve the new targets set for them. More on collectivization and agriculture later. As a side note, I hope you've noticed that I've upgraded to a much higher quality microphone. I hope you are enjoying the new and improved listening experience, and would be very grateful if you could help to support me by buying me a coffee. The link is in the description of this episode. For now, back to Stalin's Russia. Despite the problems of the first 5-year plan, Gosplan drew up the second 5-year plan in 1933, which initially had the main aim of transforming the Soviet economy into a fully socialist one. However, the final draft only called for progress on the first plan, an increase in production, and an improvement in living standards. From 1934 to 1936, the successes of the plan included the rise in machine production and iron and steel output, which allowed the Soviet Union to become self-sufficient in some areas. Linked to the successes of the second 5-year plan, the Stakhanovite movement represents the huge increase in labor activity from 1933 to 1937. Many industries had model workers who received higher bonuses, housing and other benefits, and heroes of socialist labor medals to drive labor productivity. This originated in August 1935, when a miner in the Donbass mining region of Ukraine, Alexei Stakhanov, dug up 102 tons of coal in one shift, much higher than the usual 7 tons. Following this, production targets were increased, and workers were encouraged to meet his example. Meanwhile, the worst effects of agricultural collectivization were over, which allowed for rationing to end in 1935. Despite the achievements made through the second 5-year plan, industry ran into problems again in 1937, including the growing impact of Stalin's purges of those in charge of Gosplan, and the escalating international situation. The third plan was supposed to be in place from 1938 to 1942, but it was not officially approved until the 18th Party Congress in March 1939, and was even disrupted by the German invasion of Russia in June 1941. The plan undermined light industry and the increasing production of consumer goods, as huge increases in production for heavy industry and defense were planned. Molotov believed that the third plan would complete the process of a transition to a fully socialist economy and aid the Soviet Union in becoming properly communist. Now, let's talk about how successful the first two plans actually were overall. For the period of 1928 to 1940, the Soviet Union claims that industrial production increased by 852%, whilst the West estimates that the actual increase was just 260%. There are a few reasons for this disparity. One, of course, is that the higher figures served as good propaganda for the Soviet Union to show how successful communism was and how strong the Soviet Union was under Stalin's leadership. Another important reason is that factory managers either deliberately underestimated production capacity or claimed that their production figures were higher than they had actually been able to achieve, or because they feared the punishment that they would receive for failing to meet the high targets. Thirdly, there was the issue of a lack of worker skill, with 9 million ex-peasants who had little basic training and experience in factory work joining the workforce during the first 5-year plan. They had little acceptance of factory discipline, especially being forced to work for 24 hours or more at a time in order to meet targets, a practice which led to machines breaking down frequently and further disrupting production. In 1928, 5 million kilowatt-hours of electricity were produced. Under the first 5-year plan, this was planned to increase to 17 million, but in reality, it only reached 13.4 million. Under the second 5-year plan, this was expected to reach a massive 38 million kilowatt-hours of electricity, but again fell short at 36.2 million. In 1928, 35.4 million tons of coal were produced. Under the first 5-year plan, this was planned to increase to 75 million tons, but in reality it only reached 64.3 million. Under the second 5-year plan, this was expected to reach a massive 152.5 million tonnes, but again, this fell short at 128 million tonnes. In 1928, 11.7 million tonnes of oil were produced. Under the first 5-year plan, this was planned to increase to 22 million tonnes, but in reality, it fell slightly behind by just 0.6 million tonnes. Under the second 5-year plan, the production of oil was expected to reach 46.8 million tonnes, but during this period, it only increased to 28.5 million tonnes of oil. In 1928, 3.3 million tonnes of pig iron were produced. Under the first 5-year plan, this was planned to increase to 8 million tonnes, but in reality, it reached 6.2 million tonnes. Under the second 5-year plan, the production of pig iron was expected to reach 16 million tonnes, but again, it fell behind at 14.5 million tonnes of pig iron. In 1928, the Soviet Union produced 4 million tonnes of steel, which under the first 5-year plan was expected to reach 10.4 million tonnes, but only reached 5.9 million tonnes. But under the second 5-year plan, the target of 17 million tonnes of steel was actually exceeded by 700,000 tonnes. All of these high targets had a significant impact on industrial workers, with the uninterrupted week introduced in 1929, with shift work planned over the weekend in order to stop the factories from being idle at any time. Being absent or late was initially punished by workers being fired or having their factory housing taken away, but by 1931, these offences were criminalised and those convicted were sentenced to imprisonment or a labour camp. Speaking about labour camps, timber camps were established as early as 1929, and these became controlled by the Gulag. Initially, historians estimated that up to 8 million were imprisoned in these forced labour camps, but since the collapse of the Soviet Union, this number has been estimated to be under 3 million. Those who were in these labour camps were subject to harsh conditions, including poor living conditions and a lack of food, whilst undertaking huge construction tasks of railways and canals. Overall, under the 5-year plans, the rapid industrialization led to a regression in living standards as the issues of food shortage, rising prices, and housing shortages created huge problems. On the plus side, the plans did result in the end of high unemployment rates, as the increase in factory workers contributed to the increase in joint family incomes. A good number of workers also had greater opportunities in education, as they were designed to improve the skills and productivity of the workforce. Thank you for listening to this episode of my podcast. Please click follow or subscribe to be notified when Part 2 on agriculture is released. There are links in the description for you to access additional revision material on my website, provide me with feedback, suggestions and questions, and links to my social media and methods of contacting me. Again, I would be very grateful if you would be so kind as to buy me a coffee via the link in the description. This is the end of the episode. Thank you for listening and goodbye.